The Attic Voice, also known as NIGHTSOUND by Algis Budrys. Originally published in the February 1957 issue of Satellite Science Fiction magazine, republished only once and retitled NIGHTSOUND in an anthology called Best Science Fiction Stories and Novels, 9th Series, in 1958. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. The Attic Voice, or NIGHTSOUND. The heavy oak veneered desk in the attic had been the family catch-all for years. The pigeonholes under the jammed roll-top were crammed with unimportant letters, receipted bills, circulars from the Department of Agriculture, and all the other papers that might someday have become important but never had. Now, Sam Dundee's father was dead, collapsed over his last straight furrow. The tired heart finally pushed too far, and Sam was home from State College. There were arrangements to be made, the estate to be put in order, and his mother was unable to bring herself to it. Sunk within himself, his emotions numb, Sam had been doing the best he could. He had gone through the main records down in the dining room desk, but there still might be something up here in the attic that he ought to know about. Some record of a loan or an insurance policy that would mean another debt left behind by his father, or, Sam knew how little hope there was in this, some money due the estate. He pulled open the bottom drawer and lifted off a bundle of brittle yellow newspapers. Under these was a worn book with a cheap red binding that had become faded and splotched. The imitation gold stamping was flaked and half gone. Sam picked up the book and squinted at the title page in the dim light coming through the attic window. The attic wasn't wired. With dusk falling, he should have brought a flashlight, but he had been doing things like that for the past 2 days, moving in shock, forgetting things, making mistakes, falling into long periods of mental drifting while he stopped wherever he was and simply daydreamed. The book was something called Every Farmer's Home Cyclopedia of Simple Veterinary Science. He'd never heard of it, but he wasn't surprised. It was the kind of book salesmen were continually selling on farms for $1 down and 35 cents a week for 20 weeks. He couldn't imagine his father spending the money, but as he leafed through the pretentiously printed cheap paper pages, he saw the heavy underlinings and notations in the margins done in his father's hand with a pencil stub. Sam looked at it, weighing it in his head, slowly shaking his head. It was like handling a piece of the past, like knowing suddenly, without any doubt, exactly what was going on inside a man's head. Here it was, the long-forgotten first sign of his father's resolve to have him go to veterinary school, perhaps the source of it. Sam looked at the sections that had drawn most of his father's attention. A chapter on animal surgery had its pages smudged from what must have been incessant reading. Sitting in the near dark, Sam had no trouble picturing his father in the worn armchair under the standing lamp in the parlor, with the book in his lap, and his blunt forefinger moving slowly under each line, his face set in a frown of concentration. Lying on the table next to him would be the grammar school dictionary, most of its pages loose in the binding. At intervals, his father would hold his place with one finger while he leafed through the dictionary, either muttering the definition over and over until he had memorized it, or else scowling in momentary anger when the dictionary failed to include the word that had puzzled him. The annotations almost covered the type on some of the pages. In several places there was a curt, "won't work." Once or twice he saw, "try it," following an underscored paragraph, and he wondered what his father had been doing. At the end of the chapter, his father had blocked in a characteristic comment, "Can't pay the price for the tools anyway. Don't know enough to make some. Haven't got the brains to handle them right. If I did, have to give this up and try something else." In the same way his father had talked to the plow and the water pump, his father had talked to the book. Sam smiled in the dark. Every bit of work his father did was accompanied by a steady drive of short, declarative sentences. "Gotta lift you over that rock. Push this part in here. Gonna fence you this fall." So here was the record of something else planned, possibly attempted and angrily abandoned, because there were too many things against its achievement. At this thought, Sam's smile faded. His father's life had been overfull of such defeats. The old, hard-jawed man had fought his losing battle every step of the way, trying with strength and hard work and stubbornness to do what money would have accomplished. Sam remembered his father's harsh snort. "If farmers had money, youngster, most of 'em wouldn't be farmers." So here was another time his father hadn't been able to carry something through. It must have been a long time ago, because he couldn't remember it at all. He closed the book and put it down on top of the newspapers. It would look strange, sitting on his bookshelf at college alongside the legitimate texts, but it would sit there if he ever went back. Sam looked down into the drawer. There was still something else in there, something that looked like a flat box in this light. He took it out, surprised to find that it was hard, not as cold as metal, but not as slickly smooth as plastic. He held it up to the fading light, but there was nothing to see except a faint seam that marked off a lid and a catch. Frowning, he pushed at the little metal square, seeking to unfasten it as a pressure latch first, then trying to slide it open. It didn't work in either way. Finally, he found the hairline that divided it in two and pushed in opposite ways. The latch opened, but when he tried to lift the lid, it stayed locked. The catch had slipped back as soon as he let it go. Annoyed at the designer, who seemed to have thought that people had three hands, he fumbled the lid up with his little fingers while holding the catch open, and saw that the box was a portable radio. He frowned at the three knobs, the dial, and the 2-inch grill that were set into the surface of the box under the lid. The dial was glowing luminously, and he wondered what kind of paint had managed to store up light for so long. But he wondered more about the radio's being there at all. There was an old Sears Roebuck set downstairs, sitting in the parlor with its veneer splitting from old age. But it played well enough to get the weather bulletins and the farm and home hour. Why had his father spent the money on a late-model transistor set and hidden it away up here in the attic? He couldn't figure out what make it was either. The dial was hard to read. It looked like some trick system, all symbols instead of numbers, which didn't make any sense at all. It might be a cheap Japanese set, something like that, from the looks of the symbols, but the Japs used regular American numbers on the ones they sold here. He tried to turn one of the knobs and found that to do so required more strength than he had expected. It didn't seem to do anything either. The next one moved the pointer on the dial. So the third one had to be the switch. He twisted it and felt the box begin to vibrate softly in his hands. But nothing happened after he had waited a long minute, and he wondered if the first knob was a volume control that he had turned all the way down. He twisted it back toward its first position. It had turned completely dark in the attic. There was still some light outside, but toward the east the stars were out, shining pure white in the purple-black sky. There was a click as he reset the first knob. Far away and thin he heard Nifera, Niferi, Nifero, Nifera, Niferi, Nifero, Dansiaf, Nifera. There was a pause, and then, still far, still thin, but nearer, he heard the reply, in another voice as dry and rustling as the first had been soft and lilting. Nefera, Soxim, Yanclaf, Neferi. Something frightened him. He reached out and closed the radio's lid and sat looking up at the distant stars, wondering what language he had heard. He rapped softly on his mother's door, his face troubled. He didn't want to bother her, but he had to get the radio business settled. He frowned as he tried to think of how he was going to ask her. If she didn't know anything about it, he didn't want to upset her anymore. "Who is it?" His mother's voice was nervous and apprehensive. "It's Sammy, Mom," he said, patiently, though there was no one else it could have been. "May I talk to you for a minute?" "Oh, Sammy, I wasn't asleep yet, just dozing. Were you upstairs?" "Up in the attic, Mom," he reminded her. "Looking through the old desk? Did you find anything?" she asked. "I don't know for sure. May I come in and talk to you?" He knew that if he didn't remind her, she'd forget what he wanted. "Yes, of course, Sammy." He heard her bedclothes rustle and opened the door. There was no light on, and he blinked as he made his way to her bed and sat down on the chair beside it. He took her hand. "How are you, Mom?" he asked, gently. He could see the paleness of her face in the dim light, and as his eyes slowly became accustomed to it, he saw that she was keeping her eyes closed. Her hand was limp in his, and her breathing was shallow. "Pretty well," she replied wanly. The fingers of her left hand twisted at the edge of the comforter. "I think I'll be able to get to sleep all right tonight. Is everything all right on the farm?" He nodded. "Everything's fine, Mom," he answered uncomfortably, remembering. "We've got to take good care of Annie," his father had often said, shaking his head angrily, with that frequent anger which came over him and was coming over his son now at things he couldn't do anything about. "I guess there's some women shouldn't ever have to farm," he had said slowly. "But what else can we do, boy? If a man's got a farm, he's got to work it. If a man's been a farmer all his life, he's got to stick with that. But you take care of her if I can't. You're my hope, boy. You're the best hope I've got in this world." "Did you find anything in the attic, Sammy?" his mother asked, forgetting again. She hadn't been made for a life of never having enough, Sam thought to himself. She wasn't intended to live as she had had to for 30 years, out here in country where winter froze you for half the year and the summer baked the blood out of your body. Just one child to help her, and that one not a daughter but a son to work with his father, working at the very thing that ground her life down flat, too, and not able to work enough to make it pay, no matter how little you slept or how your arms and back ached. It couldn't be done. 2 men couldn't make it pay. They could only drag enough out of the land so they could hang on, year after year, slipping downhill by inches. But you had the land, and you were born to it, and what else could you do? You hung on, hoping for you didn't know what. Going to school, grudging every hour of time, but knowing there wasn't any way out at all without the schooling. Going on to the state college. Because if you didn't, then it would be one more generation of Dundies that bled their life into the ground, hoping for something better for the next. 6 years at veterinary school, then, and 2 more to go, taking 2 semesters for every single semester's credits, because you had to work part-time for clothes and lodging and a little extra to send home. 2 years to go. Sam's lips tightened into a straight white line. There wasn't any money to pay a hired man to work the farm. Even if there had been, no hired man, no 2 men, would sweat and stretch themselves as his father had. "I don't know, Mom," he replied finally. He still didn't know how to go about asking her. He didn't even know what the radio's being in the desk could mean, but his father must have had some good reason for having it. "Do you know if anybody ever left anything with Dad for safekeeping?" he asked at last. "Tools or equipment of some kind? Or maybe somebody paid off a loan by giving Dad something like a radio? Do you know if he ever did anything like that?" "Did you find some papers?" His mother's hand tightened in his, and her voice grew with hope. "Does somebody owe Tom? Do you think it'll be enough so you can keep going to school?" Then her hand grew limp again. "No," she whispered. "That couldn't be. There's no sense trying to wish something into being true." She had been with Tom Dundee for 30 years, working beside him as much as she had it in her to, and more. She had drawn on faith in her man for strength through all that time, and the habit was still there. Sam didn't have any way of doing anything for her, but he found himself wishing she didn't still have enough hoping in her to be weaker every time it died. "You don't remember Dad's having anything like that around the house, Mom?" He kept at her, sorry he had started and wanting to get it finished. "No, Sammy, not ever." "All right, Mom. I thought there might be something, but I guess I was wrong. I'll keep looking." He slipped his hand free of hers, leaned forward and kissed her. "Good night, Mom. I'm pretty sure I can work something out." "Good night, Sammy. Don't stay up too late." He left her room quietly, closing the door softly behind him. You kept hoping, somehow. Tom Dundee had taught both of them that. It wasn't a blind thing. It was knowing deep inside yourself that a man's strength and a man's mind ought to be enough in this world, that if you held out long enough, things had to turn your way. But it was hard, losing the man. He and his mother had both lived with his father, following him, taking the way he picked. Now he was gone, and they were both lost for a while. But there'd be a way out. The world hadn't changed merely because one man was gone. Sam came into his own room and looked at the radio on the dresser. The crops grew, and the rain came down. There was always food growing, always a roof to live under. They were strong factors, permanent things that were rooted in more than one man's life. It was just that these factors didn't seem useful any longer. Why had his father had that radio? Sam went to it and opened it without knowing exactly why, except that he was trying to find something to do. Far away, farther than the first voices he'd heard, there was a burst of crystalline chiming and a fainter answer. He twisted the stiff dial, moving down the band, and wisps of voices grew to clarity, faded, and were gone again. Raini, sir, gut, tagat, vol, stethan, flamit, so mahal, dundi, what? His fingers froze. Dundee! Dundee! The voice was harsh and deep, like no voice he had ever heard speaking English before. Dundee! Answer me, please! What's happened to you? Somewhere among those people who spoke along these bandwidths, someone else was lost and uncertain because Tom Dundee was dead. It was late at night, but Sam didn't look at his watch to check the time. For several hours now, he had been sitting on the edge of his bed, listening to the radio calling his father's name at intervals, in a voice that sounded like the note of some heavy machine crushing out a tunnel in the rock far underground. Of all the people in the world, if you knew anybody, you knew your parents. You knew the sound and mood of every kind of footstep they could take, the meaning of every cough that cleared their throats before they spoke to you. You knew the touch of their hands and the rustle of their clothes. He tried to picture his father, sitting and listening to that voice, answering it somehow, but he couldn't. Nothing he knew or remembered was any help to him. His father was a man who had kept much to himself. If he had wanted to talk to somebody over that radio without letting anybody know about it, there was always time during the day when he could have used it in privacy, but Sam couldn't think of any reason for his doing it. He remembered something his father had told him once. "Youngster, it's no good talking about something you're doing. If it works out, then you got something better to talk about. If it don't, nobody knows you've been a damn fool but you." That would explain his father's not telling him, but it didn't explain what the radio was all about. It might have been going on for years. His father had seen too many seasons come and go and come back again to act for tomorrow or next month. "Son, how about you going off to vet school up at State College? Seems to me we could swing it." He remembered that with absolute clarity. His father, 12 years ago, had turned to him at supper one night and said it, with the idea thought over in his head for nobody knew how long beforehand. "State pays for your schooling, no trouble there. Be a little tight, with clothes and food to pay for, and us missing your help here, but it's worth it." It was. It was worth the extra work his father had to go back to doing, an older man than the one he had been before Sam could do a man's work. A veterinary didn't have to kill himself over a plow for his food and his roof. A veterinary's mother could live in a house in town with no more chores to do, and a veterinary's wife wouldn't dry up and grow into a thin, pale woman with creases in her forehead and the skin chapping on her hands until it cracked open. So now Sam was 3/4 of the way to being a graduate veterinary, and Tom Dundee had killed himself to get him there. That had been 12 years in the planning. Sam raised his head. The voice on the radio was saying something else. "I know someone is listening. I repeat, I know someone is listening to me. It is imperative that anyone connected with Thomas Dundee of Minnesota reply to this message." The voice was still heavy, still deep, but now it was desperate. Sam didn't move. He was sure that he should. He knew he didn't want to. "Please, anyone with information regarding the present whereabouts of Thomas Dundee, it is urgent that I hear from him immediately. If he is unavailable, please locate someone truly able to speak for him." Sam got to his feet and stood over the radio, his fists clenched. "To operate the transmitting apparatus, move the first button to the left. Repeat. To transmit, switch the first button to the left. Speak toward the grill. I will now wait 2 minutes for a reply." Sam reached out toward the knob, wondering who it was that wasn't quite sure of left and right. Then he snapped the knob over because he didn't dare not do it. "This is Sam Dundee," he said shakily. "Who are you?" He waited, but there wasn't any answer until he realized he ought to switch the knob back. "Dee's son? Are you Tom Dundee's son? The student?" "Yes, look, who are you?" "I can't tell you that if your father is available. Is he all right?" "He's dead, mister. I found the radio by accident. I don't know anything about this. If you want anything, you'd better explain." "Dundee died? How long ago?" 3 days. There was an odd, unidentifiable noise before the voice answered. Then it said, "You are almost finished with your studies, aren't you?" "It'll be 2 years yet, mister." 2 years? I don't know whether I can A pause, then, "I'm sorry for you about your father. Will you help me?" Sam clamped his jaws together. "Not unless I know who I'm helping and what this is all about. I'm sorry. I'm being hasty, but I have a very good reason. If I do not have help soon, I shall be dead too. When I lost contact with your father, You understand? I lost my composure. I'm not in a position to extend my trust to very many people. Your father found me a number of years ago, but he could not help me. I gave him the communicator so we could keep in contact, and he could advise me when circumstances had changed. I have slowed my metabolism to nearly the critical level, but if you cannot help me soon, it will be too late. I apologize for my brusqueness, but I'm also prey to emotions. I ask you again, will you help me?" Sam looked down at the radio, the communicator. He knew his face was pale. He wiped his hand across his face, and his fingers were damp when they came away. Outside, he knew the stars were shining cold and clear on this moonless night, and he knew, too, that there were voices whispering across the night between the stars. He took a deep breath. "I don't know," he answered slowly. "I'd have to see you. How far away are you?" The voice made the odd sound again. It might have been a sigh. "Somewhere on your father's holding. I don't know where in relation to your domicile. I came down at night, and too quickly. I will broadcast a beam of sound. Walk along it, and I will guide you. You are a student. You are aware that not all organisms must resemble one of your race, that intelligence and emotion may nevertheless be present. I'll be coming. I thank you." Quietly, Sam walked downstairs and got the flashlight. Holding the communicator, he stepped out into the yard, listening, as the voice said, "I will start the beam now." A series of sharp clicks began to come from the speaker. Walking slowly in the darkness, picking his way with the flashlight's help, Sam left the yard, sometimes having to go off the beam and find it again when confronted by a building or a fence. He figured out where he was headed almost immediately. There was a section of woods that he and his father had never cleared, or had ever intended to, what with so many other things to take care of. He came down at night, Sam thought, and quickly. I wonder where he's from. I wonder which of the languages I heard is the one his people speak. The earth under his feet felt different, somehow, than it had ever felt before. Not as solid, yet better. He walked into the woods, threading his way between the trees. I hear your footsteps. The beam was cut off, and the voice spoke to him again. Walk slowly. Look down. Some of the trees were half toppled, leaning against others, as though a windstorm had pushed them over. He must have walked through here 100 times. Stop! He looked down, and the dead leaves stirred, a few feet in front of him. He saw movement under them, something that looked like a sluggish rock, not too big. He saw a stir of thick arms that were like petrified tree roots bending under enormous pressure. I have internal injuries, the voice said, booming and grating out from the ground instead of from the communicator. Sam switched it off and shut the lid automatically. I cannot dig out my ship and repair it. As I am, I have no access to my medical supplies or the interstellar transmitter. I have only my personal kits." The rock twisted itself sideward, and he saw an oval patch on its side with a dark stain in its center. "I was thrown clear. We're a tough people, and the ship is made of the same substance as the communicator case, but I cannot reach it. I am at your mercy. If you help me, my bargain with your father will hold. I will tell you how to construct some of the circuits which make the communicator and the ship's propulsion fields possible. I understand such knowledge is negotiable here." Sam nodded. "Yes, it is. There's a patent office and companies that build electronic instruments, but I think I'd help you anyway." He thought about the old veterinary cyclopedia with his father's stubborn notes. "I think I can do it. If not right now, very soon. Thank you. You are much like your father." "I hope so, mister," Sam answered. "I hope so." You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.